Hi everyone, I'm Gudrun Bergman and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm interviewing Neil Woods, and Neil is a former UK undercover officer who's now a prominent international activist for drug law reform, and he'll be speaking at the conference HEMP for the Future in Salnum in Kópavogi on the 11th and the 12th. He'll be speaking both days. So welcome to my show, Neil.
Thank you. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you too. So what are you going to be talking about at the conference?
Okay, so the first day I'll be partnering with Maren King, who is a co-member of an organization that I'm a co-founder of, which is, it's a mouthful, bear with me. We are the International Coalition for Drug Law Reform and Environmental Justice. So on that first day, representing that coalition, I will be explaining how the international drug policy regime is a barrier to climate justice and climate action. And that's the focus of the international coalition. So our members include grassroots activists in Latin America. It includes academics from most continents, activists and various people. And we are essentially explaining this link and the fact that we can't really solve the climate crisis while we have this international drug policy regime. And so why this is important for hemp in particular is that hemp is one of those solutions that we need to be moving on quickly. And that not just because it's a great carbon sink, not just because it has many applications which can replace things like plastics or concrete, but also because by moving to a regulated and controlled use of substances like hemp, we actually also undermine the power of organized crime and reduce the levels of corruption, which is a barrier to climate justice.
So we're talking about two barriers, actually.
Yeah, well, there's many barriers within that link. I mean, the most important, actually, when we talk about the climate crisis, is the fact that in order to have action on the climate crisis, if we persuade governments to sign certain treaties at the COP or any other kind of international conference or through diplomacy, it's important that whatever document they sign, they are able to fulfill their obligations to that treaty. Now, if you look just, for example, at the deforestation treaties, many of the governments who have signed those treaties, they don't control their own backyards. They have no power to enact what they've agreed to in that document because organized crime controls the forests. And so, but the reason for that is because of the vast wealth and the power that's been created from the drug supply. And that's only a vast wealth and power because of drug prohibition. And we urgently need to be understanding this and taking action on this if we want to save our planet. So that'll be the topic for the first day.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, and I hope that people come and hear more and you know, think of some awkward questions. We will have the answers, Maren and myself. But this is, I mean, it is an emerging issue. You know, wherever I go, you know, you have that that sort of that jaw-dropping moment, but you can see it clicking with people and people's understanding because it's a very new aspect to this debate, both the drug policy and the environmental debate. But on the second day, I will be talking about broader drug policy because the second day of the conference has an emphasis also on medical cannabis use. Now, moving forward with medical cannabis is very important because one of the biggest markets is the cannabis market, right? And we should all know by now that we're never going to stop people consuming cannabis, just like we're never actually going to stop people consuming other drugs. And policing never reduces the size of these markets. Deterrents don't work. There is evidence of that. Policing just wastes police resources. And so medical cannabis is an opportunity to take money out of the pockets of organized crime, apart from the obvious benefits that people's health can be improved. Depending on, apart from the health benefits, there's also a benefit in fighting organized crime. And so on the second day, I'm going to explain some of the intricacies of the economics of the drug markets, including some stories from my undercover career, which emphasize these points in terms of the lack of impact of policing drug markets. So, so again, I invite any and all questions and make them as difficult as you want to. But I look forward to that debate on the second day. So obviously these two topics are overlap.
Yeah.
But the second day will be more of a general drug policy discussion, or rather a presentation. And this will be particularly relevant to anybody who is concerned with the growth of organized crime's influence in the existing drug markets in Iceland, and what can be done, genuinely can be done to impact on that.
Yes, this is a huge thing in Iceland. It's such a small country. So how long did you work as an undercover agent?
Between 1993 and 2007, so just over 13 years. It wasn't 13 years constantly undercover.
No.
I would do sort of 6 or 7 months in a city in the UK, and then take a break of about that amount of time, and where I would be doing normal sort of covert investigation to organised crime. And then I would go undercover again for 6 or 7 months. So over the space of 13 years.
So did you work in various cities in the UK?
I did, yeah, as far north as Leeds and as far south as Brighton, with lots of places in between.
Yeah, that's quite a territory to cover. So I want to ask you one thing: did your undercover work result in breaking up some of the organized crime units, or?
Yeah, I mean, I did have some extraordinary success, if you can use that word, and I use it loosely because the word success with drugs policing can often be an illusion. But when I began my career working undercover, I completely believed in the system, and I believed that seizing large quantities of drugs and arresting lots of drug dealers could actually have an impact on society and the market. And so I had notable successes infiltrating gangs in the city of Leicester, in Nottingham as well. But in order to do that, I had to, because of the type of undercover work I did was slightly different to the traditional undercover work, which is done at a high level. And what I mean as a high level is level 1 undercover work generally is where you get introduced by a police informant into a high level of organized crime and infiltrate over a long period of time. The kind of work that I did was to start at the bottom without an introduction and work my way up to see how far up the pyramid I could climb, which meant spending time with problematic drug users. So people who are using primarily heroin and crack cocaine problematically. And so I had to mingle with those people and manipulate those people. And in fact, wherever I would go to a city centre at the beginning of the operation, what I would do is I would look for the most vulnerable of those people.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because the most vulnerable is the easiest to manipulate, for one. And if that sounds ruthless, well, of course it's ruthless. That is the nature of the work I was doing. But also the most vulnerable are often the people who are using the most drugs because they're self-medicating for the worst of childhood trauma. And they had the most connections. They could introduce me further up the ladder and get me to meet the sort of regional dealers who are sort of middle management. So that's what I would do. And often it was dangerous. Often I was surrounded by people using drugs intravenously. I would mingle in squats and various other places. And, I've when I did get introduced to those middle managers, so, you know, I've had a samurai sword to my throat. I've been robbed at knife point. I've been interrogated with a knife pressed into my groin, which is most unsettling, actually. Makes conversation very difficult.
I would think so.
And but as the years went on, I did have growing doubts about the efficacy and the success, because, you know, at the end of the operation, I would always catch some gangsters. You know, for the operation in Nottingham, I think there was 58 people arrested, and, you know, getting big prison sentences. But I was increasingly becoming disillusioned. But I kept going, because when you're wrapped up in the world of covert policing, you know, you need to sort of be focused and believe in it to keep going, and also to keep safe, right? I needed to push doubts to one side in order to remain as safe as I could. But I had growing doubts for so many reasons. I mean, for example, with the Nottinghamshire operation, I met a young man who was one of my vulnerable people, who he was using heroin to self-medicate for childhood abuse from his father. And I found that all of the people using heroin or crack that were self-medicating problematically, they all had these stories. They were all of them self-medicating for childhood trauma, which when I began that journey, I didn't know that. I looked down on people who were using drugs problematically as just being stupid enough to try them in the first place. I didn't understand. So I went through this journey of understanding by spending time and listening to people, which, of course, which was useful to me, because I needed to know how to behave, right? So nowadays I call it weaponizing empathy, which is what I did.
Yeah.
But this chap called Cammy in Nottinghamshire, at the end of the operation, he was arrested as well, because he was committing offences on bail, and he eventually got 3.5 years in prison. But when he was in police custody, he ended up on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the reason for that is because he saw my betrayal of him as the last straw, because he thought I was his one friend in the world, the first person he found that he could talk to. Now, the thing is, the skills that I developed meant that I'm good at manipulating people. I could get people to do what I wanted. I did.
Yeah.
But that's the skills inherent in the profession, which makes it the most intrusive thing the police can do, or the government can do. Because I can go into people's lives and get them to do what I want. That's more intrusive than tapping someone's phone or searching someone's house. It's much more intrusive.
Yeah, definitely.
And in the UK, actually, there is no judicial oversight of that. The oversight is all from within policing. Whereas if I want to tap someone's phone, I have to go to the Home Secretary for that. There's only one person can authorize that.
I see.
So there's judicial oversight for everything else, but for the most intrusive tactic, there isn't. And there are scandals as a result of this going on at the moment that people might have heard of in the UK. So as a result of that and other things, I had doubts, but I kept going. And I also, I think probably by 2003, 2004, in hindsight, I developed complex PTSD as well.
Yeah, I would think so. It's a very stressful job.
Yeah. And the problem is with complex PTSD, it's like the death of 1,000 cuts. It adds up and adds up, right? And the problem is I was in the middle of that trauma, and I just kept pushing on, because I got so obsessed with developing my skills to survive, developing my skills to do a good job. Catching the next gangsters, is always obsessed with catching the next gangsters. So I was a few years away from a complete mental collapse. But certainly by the time I investigated a gang called the Burger Bar Boys, I was already struggling with my mental health, but just kept going.
Yeah.
And the Burger Bar Boys are a very infamous gang in the UK, and I travel around the world, and people say that's a very British name for a gang. The Burger Bar Boys.
Burger Bar Boys. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, they're a very infamous gang from Birmingham. And a few just before I started my operation to get close to them, a few months before, they were involved in the double murder of two young women. They machine gunned these two young women in Birmingham. And they were infamous for being at war with another gang called the Johnson Crew, and there's multiple murders. The main target for my operation was implicated in 7 different murders. So, they were so I knew the caliber of these people. And I'll never forget when I got the direct introduction after many weeks of manipulating people. I got shown into this snooker club and then into this toilet. And the guy interviewed me. He's stood on the toilet, looking over the top of the cubicle down at me. And while he was doing that, he had 400 figures walking around me. And every so often, one of them would assault me. They'd headbutt me on the ear or they'd punch me in the ribs. All the time, this guy's looking down and interrogating me. So that was not the most polite introduction to them, but at the end of I think I was about 6 weeks into the operation, but at the end of that, I actually exchanged mobile phone numbers with them. And so I got into them actually quite much quicker than I'd expected. And then I spent the next, I think, 6 months gaining evidence of conspiracy against the 6 main gang that were controlling the supply in that region. And so, I mean, the thing is about that gang that there's not for 1 minute did I feel safe in their company at any time. And so the daily sort of, it just added to those layers, if you know what I mean, the traumatized layers. And then one day they stripped me. They told me to strip. They said, "You're 5-0, man. You're heat," meaning they thought I was a cop. Or maybe they were just reminding me he was boss. I don't know. But they made it clear I had to strip because one of them lifted a T-shirt up and he had a gun tucked into the top of his tracksuit bottoms. So all of these things were going on, but by the end of the operation, it was a 7-month operation. I remember in the secret location that we had, because you don't do this kind of undercover work from a police station, you do it from covert locations.
Yeah.
I remember looking at the big whiteboards and all of the links between things. And if you've ever seen a crime drama where you have like whiteboards and lines drawn between people and photos, it's exactly like that. Like exactly.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I remember looking at all of this sort of the tapestry of all of the links and things. And I remember feeling really pleased looking at it because we'd got evidence against 96 people in that. 96.
That's enormous.
It is. It's enormous. And we knew, I knew that there was no one else to meet in this operation because every phone number I'd got, I'd identified every link in the chain and got evidence against everybody. There was no one else to get. So I was thinking, wow, we're just going to sweep this city clean. It's going to be remarkable. We had police from 5 different police forces backing us up, helping out, hundreds of cops involved in the arrest phase. And I remember the intelligence officer, the head of the intelligence cell for the job, speaking to me 2 weeks after the dust had settled. And his job was to work out the impact of the operation and what had happened. And he said to me, "Yeah, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in the city for a full 2 hours."
Wow. What's that?
7 months of work, all of those people arrested, all of the time and effort and all of the things I went through for the sake of interrupting that market for 2 hours.
So what happened then? Did somebody else take over, or did they have another layer of the organization that took over?
The great truth of this, when police celebrate, these seizures and these arrests, you upset a gang when you catch them, right? You do. But you make another one very happy. Because policing drugs never, ever reduces the size of the market anywhere in the world. doesn't matter how big a population or how small a population, the demand remains, and all it does is create an opportunity in that market for somebody else. And that's the reality of drugs policing that we have to face up to. And there is no evidence to the contrary of that. No police force in the world can produce evidence that they have successfully reduced the size of the market or reduced crime by drugs policing. Because actually, more often than not, where you create a gap in that market, you actually have an increase in violence immediately afterwards. Because that gap in the market, because of it's destabilized, it's fought over. And people see that opportunity and you fight over it.
Yeah.
You also get price drops. Because where people don't compete with violence, people will come in and have a cheaper product to try and win the loyalty of the customers. Yeah. So, and you also get increases in corruption, which I can explain probably on at the conference. But the reason why you get an increase in corruption as a result of police activity, and I've come across corruption, I've seen it right up and very closely, and it stopped shocking me, the levels of corruption as a result of drug prohibition.
And corruption in the police force?
Police, yeah, and everywhere. I had
a judicial system as well?
Everywhere, judicial system, all over. Yeah. I have I've come across it so many times that I've become quite obsessed with understanding it. And so for the last few years, as part of LEAP around the world, I've been investigating the level of it around the world. And that also informs part of the coalition, the climate coalition work, understanding how corruption is a barrier to fighting the climate crisis.
Yeah, corruption seems to be everywhere and blooming at that.
Yes.
So, but you wrote a book about, your memoir. How did you get through your PTSD? And you wrote a memoir. Was that a way to do that?
Well, in order to do it, I've teamed up with a proper writer. I write articles for newspapers. I've written for The Guardian and things like that. But to do a whole book, I think was stretching my abilities as a writer. So I teamed up with my good friend, who is now my good friend, J.S. Raffaeli, and he helped me write that. And so in order to do that, he interviewed me over and over again. And it was a horrible experience, if I'm honest, because having to go over and revisit the events in the book was difficult, and I've done therapy, which didn't really help. I've done multiple therapies, and suddenly I'm having to do therapy again by explaining all these things to JS. And and he would dig into more detail than a therapist, because he said he would want every little detail. You walk into this room, what color was the carpet? What was the walls look like? He wanted all of it. All of it. So he was extracting things from my memory that I didn't even know I had. But we got through it. And I think that actually traveling around and talking about those experiences after the book I think it has helped, because it's, there are still memory blocks that I have. I still suddenly discover new triggers for PTSD that I don't really understand. So it's but it's made me sturdier, I think. Being able to talk about it publicly has made me able to adapt to my condition a lot better.
That's wonderful, because talking about things is kind of like releasing them all the time.
Yeah, true. I tend to get triggers not speaking about that. I don't mind speaking about it publicly or on a podcast like this, but I tend to get my triggers when I'm traveling between events, like
I see, yeah.
At a train station or...
Do you always see everything that's happening there? Like at a train station, do you see the dealers? Do you spot them?
I'm constantly, I always see them. I constantly see...
what's happening in...
Yeah.
Around. Yeah.
Generally, yeah. And then, of course, anxiety makes things bigger, louder,
Yeah.
I'm still not comfortable unless I can choose carefully where I sit somewhere, or I can never lose any of those kind of things. And but sometimes a trigger, just there is no explanation for it. Suddenly I'm just hyper vigilant. My heart's pounding, and it comes from nowhere sometimes.
Yeah. So do you think you're on somebody's hit list?
No, I don't think so. I mean, when I was still working, I had death threats. In fact, I was giving evidence at Leicester Crown Court, and there was intelligence about a credible threat to my life, that they were going to try and murder me before I gave evidence. And I remember that there was a surveillance team. I had a 6-vehicle surveillance team to follow me away from the Crown Court to make sure that I wasn't being followed.
Yeah.
So there was all of those kind of safeguards. But once the people were convicted, the threat ended. And that's the way I see it now, really, because there's no reason for anybody that I've convicted to come after me, because that would be a great risk at no gain.
Yeah.
So, these people in the drug market are just pragmatic business people. They only use violence as where they perceive it to be useful for the business, to intimidate people who might be police informants, to prevent them, grassing them up, or to intimidate witnesses, or that kind of thing. But
you call your book "Good Cop, Bad War." Is that like your realization that the war you were fighting wasn't worth it, or?
Yeah, that it's a bad war, that it's a war that shouldn't be happening. It's a war that is only causing harm. The war on drugs isn't actually a war on an object. It's a war on people, and it's a war on vulnerable people for the most part, because it's the people who are using drugs problematically which tend to suffer from it. And that's not all people, because 90% of people who use drugs have no problematic relationship with those drugs. And even the 10% that do have a problem with drugs, it's a sliding scale, right?
Yeah.
So most people need a certain amount of intervention of help, and the smallest minority of people are really problematic. But we're sold this idea that all drugs are a problem, and that's simply not true.
Yeah. So that's going to be interesting, talking about hemp, because it kind of feels like that's going to be very important for our future.
It is. It's one of the easy wins, actually.
Yeah.
It's one of the easiest, most cost-effective wins. People talk about the need to move into hydrogen, but you've got such complicated ways of making hydrogen that's green hydrogen, that's not extracted in more problematic ways. Hemp, you don't really have that problem. All of the solutions are inherent in the plant.
Yeah.
Even planting it's such a dramatic carbon sink. Even having it growing is part of the solution. And then you have the way that you can use the plant is also has so many applications. So, like solar, it's one of the easy wins that we need to be moving faster on, that can really erode away the petroleum industries. So we need governments investing in it, because one of the problems is corruption. The corruption that I talk about primarily is corruption that comes from the vast wealth of the drug markets. But there is also political corruption by oil lobbyists influencing politics. And one of the things that they do is to slow down the move into things like hemp. So we need politicians everywhere to be championing these easy solutions. Yeah.
So we need to get some politicians to come visit the conference to listen to you.
If possible, if possible on both days as well, hopefully.
Yeah, because of the influence it can have on both ideas. I would love for you to send me a link to your books, because there's another one, Drug Wars. So what are you talking about then in that book?
Yeah, so I teamed up with I got to be very good friends with JS, and he's a very accomplished journalist. So we spent over a year researching drug wars, and it's essentially a history of drug policy, but with a focus on the rise and fall of what's called the British system. So the international drug policy that we have at the moment is essentially American imperialism. Before we had the international drug policy regime that we do, there were two opposing drug policy systems. There was the American system and the British system. The British system followed the simple premise that drug addiction is an unfortunate medical condition for which people should be cared for. That's the basis of the British system.
Yeah.
And what that meant, that if you developed a problem addicted to heroin, then you should be given a clean supply of that drug to protect you from a dangerous supply and to protect you from the exploitation of criminals. Basic premise. The same for cocaine or anything else.
Okay, so there wasn't any treatment offered.
There was treatment,
yeah.
But the most important thing was to keep people alive and safe.
Okay.
The opposing system internationally was the American system, which is sort of based on really the sort of puritanical traditions of the Protestant power base in America, which was to treat drug addiction as a moral failing for which people should be criminalized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, what that created with the American prohibition was the power. It created organized crime.
Yeah.
There wasn't organized crime before. It created organized crime, international organized crime. The British system meant that we didn't have any organized crime in Britain at all.
Before, yeah.
Before.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the United States bankrolled both the First and the Second World War. And this meant that the UK owed a huge amounts of money to the United States, and the United States could decide what interest was charged on that. This was the case with many countries. And so the only country really that came out of the Second World War wealthier than when they started was the USA. And they used this genuine superpower that's what made them really genuinely a superpower for the first time, I would argue. They used that power to influence the world on policy. And one of those policies was drug policy. And so they wrote the treaties that we now have, the United Nations treaties. The first of those was signed in 1961. And that meant that the whole world fell into line with the American way of doing things, the American drug policy, and the British system started to die. Now, under American pressure, at the end of the 1960s, the British system was killed off. At that point, we had 1,046 heroin consumers in the UK. That's all. In less than 15 years, we went up to 300,000. There is a very clear cause and effect because the market was handed to organized crime.
Yeah.
That's when we got our heroin explosion. That's when we caught up with other countries that had prohibited heroin completely. And we had the problem of all the associated crime and associated power of organized crime that we have now. And so drug wars follows the lead up to that decision and the events and the impact on Britain and around the world as a result of that.
The policy making, that's, yeah. This is scary numbers, and I'm sure they're much, much higher now, but scary numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's around the same, actually.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
But I mean, one of the reasons, of course, is we have the highest drug death rate in Europe. And we do, yeah. In Scotland, actually, just Scotland on its own has the highest drug death rate per capita in the world. And that's because we have strict punitive drug policy, lots of investment in drugs policing. We have the highest prison population per capita in Europe as a result of our drug policy. So, the fact that we're literally losing thousands of people to drugs, mostly opioids, is one of the few things keeping the numbers down to 300,000. Okay,
yeah, so the opioids have taken over.
Yeah, opioids still dominate. We've got a vastly growing cocaine using population. It's now the second most used drug after cannabis. I'm sure Iceland will be the same in that because it's a worldwide phenomenon. Cocaine consumption is growing massively. The price has dropped. Wholesale price of cocaine has dropped shockingly. Actually, dramatic drops in price and dramatic increases in demand. So again, we can't cope with that with law enforcement solutions. We have to be looking at this through a public health lens.
It's going to be very, very interesting. It's been very interesting hearing all this. Thank you so much. But it's going to be very, very interesting to hear what more you have to say at the conference. So I really look forward to seeing you there. And I trust that the listeners will join us on both days to hear you speak, because you have such a wealth of background information to share with us. So thank you again. And you're going to send me information about your websites and your books so that I can put that as a link under our talk.
Yes, of course. No problem at all. For the Environmental Coalition, I will have some paper copies of our first report for those that want one of those. And I'll also be able to get a PDF copy of that to anybody who wants it. They just need to come and speak to me at the conference and I can help them out with that. We also have, for those people who have contacts in Latin America, we also have, it's just been translated into Spanish as well. So there's lots of more information that I can give to anyone interested. And I look forward to seeing you there and anyone else who's going to come and meet me there at the conference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you soon.